Good morning, Sanctuary Covenant Church. This morning we are jumping back into our study of the final book of the Bible, Revelation. If you haven't already done so, I recommend watching the Bible Project video, Revelation Part 1, as a review of chapters 1 to 11. A link to that video is included in the email that we sent out, and I've also included a link in the description of this video. If you haven't already figured this out about me, I love a good story. I love telling stories, I love reading stories, I love watching stories, and I've had lots of opportunities to do that over the past few weeks stuck at home in quarantine. Good stories are an important part of life, whether it's a book, a movie, or just a story that you tell over coffee with friends. Good stories can have a powerful impact on the way that we see and understand the world. They tell us about ourselves and the world that we live in. They help us wrestle with the big questions about good and evil. They encourage us to live lives that are bigger than ourselves. This is true of The Lord of the Rings, of Star Wars, the fairy tales of George MacDonald, the Iliad. It's also true of the chapter that we're looking at today, Revelation chapter 12. Revelation 12 is written intentionally as a myth, as a story that explores the deep questions of life and helps readers to understand the world and the time in which we live. To accomplish this task, the story presented in Revelation 12 borrows imagery from other great myths that would have been familiar to the original readers. For example, Revelation 12 tells the story of a pregnant woman who is pursued by a dragon who is intent on killing her child, but she is protected by God, gives birth to the child, and then the child defeats the dragon. Now, upon hearing this, the original audience would have immediately made a connection to the Greek myth of Leto and Python, which tells the story of a pregnant woman who is pursued by a dragon who is intent on killing her child, but she's protected by a god, in this case Zeus, and gives birth to a child who goes on to defeat the dragon. Not hard to make the connection, at least not if you live in the ancient Greco-Roman Empire. So, why does John do this? Why does he borrow from a non-biblical myth to tell an essentially Christian story? Well, first, I think it's because he understands the power of a good story to shape people's imaginations. Throughout much of Revelation, John is focused on shaping our imagination so that we might see the world more closely to how God sees it. Secondly, John was convinced that there truly was a war going on. And the point of this passage is to help Christians understand what their relationship to the great spiritual war should be. Before we get to the meaning of the story, as we've talked about before, we first have to understand the reference. In this case, the characters of the story and who or what they refer to. The first character we're introduced to in verses 1 and 2 is described as a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She is pregnant and about to give birth. So who is this woman? Well, as with most of the symbols in Revelation, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, contain the answer. Those familiar with the book of Genesis might recognize some of the imagery used to describe the woman. In Genesis 37, Joseph, the one who had the coat of many colors, shares a dream that he had of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him, the 12th star. The sun was his father Jacob, who later would be called Israel. The moon is his mother Rachel, and the other 11 stars are his brothers. Together, this constellation/family are the beginning of the nation and people known as Israel. And so when Revelation says that the woman is clothed with the sun, the moon, and 12 stars, it's a direct reference to the people of Israel. Similarly, the prophetic book of Isaiah also several times describes the people of Israel like a woman who's pregnant, crying out and about to give birth, just as the woman in the story is. So it's likely that this woman, this symbolic woman of Revelation 12, is meant to represent Israel specifically and, more generally, the people of God throughout time. The next verse, Revelation 12:3, introduces another sign, another character, an enormous red dragon who seeks to devour the child of the woman. This dragon is the most easily identified sign in the chapter because in verse 9, he is explicitly declared to be that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan who leads the whole world astray. So that's the first two characters. The third major character in the story is the child with whom the woman is pregnant. He is described in verse 5 as a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This is clearly a reference to the Messiah, that is, to Christ. The quoted phrase about ruling with an iron scepter is taken from Psalm chapter 2, which is a passage long considered to be about the Messiah. Now, the iron scepter that the child rules with is actually a shepherd's staff, and some translations even reflect this by translating rule in verse 5 as shepherd. So this quoted verse is not really about Jesus being a dictator so much as saying that he will shepherd his people with strength and with kindness. And so there's the woman, the child, and the dragon. The story is introduced in verses 1 to 6 and then completed, if you can call it completed, in verse 13 to 17. It's actually left open-ended and connects to the rest of the book of Revelation, and we'll get to that in later weeks. But then verses 7 to 12 are essentially a story within a story. They describe the great war in heaven between Michael the archangel, together with God's angelic army, fighting against the dragon, Satan, and his angels. The dragon is not powerful enough and is hurled down to the earth. This is followed by a hymn or a poem of praise, declaring the kingdom and triumph of God. That's Revelation 12. Now, it's tempting to try and explain every single nuance in this text, to answer all of the questions about when each event takes place, and to try and make a one-to-one correlation for every event and symbol in the passage. But doing that is really actually unnecessary, and in fact runs the risk of missing the forest for the trees. What I think is more important is to figure out what the big point that John is trying to make is. What is this story meant to be telling us? What's the big idea? And I think that the answer to that question is found in how the story ends. Look again at verse 17, which says, "Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus." The woman's other offspring is a reference to the Christian church, the people of God who've come to faith as a result of Jesus' faithful actions on the cross. The rest of the women's offspring are the people to whom John is writing, and they're us. So I think the point that he's trying to make is that we, those who follow Jesus, are at war right now, continually. Though the victory is assured because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, the dragon is not yet fully defeated. And so he continues to fight, all the more filled with rage because of the surety of his failure. He fights like a wounded and cornered animal. And because he couldn't defeat the woman's son, Jesus, he now wages war against Christ's brothers and sisters, which is the church, both the original audience to whom John wrote and all Christians from then until now, including us. The dragon is waging war against the people of God. And so what does that war look like? What tools does the devil use to wage war against Christians? Well, this passage actually tells us a lot about that if we're willing to look closely. In verse 10, the dragon is described as the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night. The Hebrew word Satan, which has come to be used as a proper name, is actually a title that means simply the accuser. Similarly, the Greek word, which we translate as the devil, means the slanderer. From this, we can understand that one of the dragon's primary weapons against the faithful is slander and accusation. It's guilt and shame. As Darrell Johnson writes in his book, Discipleship on the Edge, the dragon hassles God's people through the constant engendering of guilt. The dragon hassles God's people by slandering them before God and others, by saying that they are not worthy of God's love because of their sin. Have you ever heard that message? I know that I have, more times than I can count. And unfortunately, I've often believed it, thinking that that must be how God thinks of me. But guilt and shame and accusation are not the tools of God. It's not the language of God. That's not how God treats us or thinks of us. Instead, I think we're invited by this passage and by so many others to recognize that the voice of accusation is the voice of the devil, not God. The dragon, the devil, is the accuser. But Revelation's description of him doesn't stop there. He's the accuser, but he's also the deceiver. Verse 9 says that he leads the whole world astray. When Jesus referred to the devil in John 8:44, he described him as the father of lies. Deception, just like accusation, is fundamental to the character of the devil. Lies are his native tongue. Thirdly, John says the dragon seeks to kill. In verse 4, he attempts to kill the child. In verse 15, he tries to kill the woman. And verse 17 says that even now he is waging war against the faithful who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. The dragon uses death as a weapon of intimidation. Hebrews 2:14 and 15 attest to this, saying that the devil holds the power of death and uses it to keep humans in slavery through their fear of death. All three of these weapons of the enemy are antitheses to how God relates to humanity. Satan is the accuser, where God is the defender and forgiver. Satan is the liar, and in God there is only truth. And where Satan uses the fear of death to keep people in slavery, Jesus came to set us free and to give us eternal life. So, how do we fit in? What is our place in this war? Are we merely spectators, victims, or are we meant to engage the enemy, to fight back? I believe that one of the main purposes of Revelation 12 is a call to arms. I think that we, as followers of Jesus, are given this story as an encouragement to take up our weapons and to fight for our lives and for the lives of others in a spiritual war. That said, let me be clear. The war that we're in is not and is never a physical war, and it's not and is never against other people. As Ephesians 6:12 says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Death and violence are the tools of the devil, not of Christ. And any time that the church has picked up physical weapons, it has inadvertently assisted the dragon in his work. Death and destruction are the devil's tools, not God's, and they shouldn't be ours. That said, we are in a war, and we are called to fight. So, what weapons are we meant to use? How do we fight this war that we find ourselves in? Well, Revelation 12:11, which I think is the key verse of this chapter, holds the answer. It says, "They triumphed by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death." 3 weapons are given to us: the blood of the Lamb, the word of testimony, and not fearing death. When the dragon speaks accusation, we respond by declaring that the blood of the Lamb has cleansed us from all sin. When the devil condemns us, shames us, accuses us with our sin, we can simply reply, "Yes, I have sinned, but Christ has died for me, and Christ lives in me, and I am forgiven and cleansed of my sin." We fight this battle with the blood of the Lamb by refusing to engage in slander and accusation, whether it's against other people or against our very selves. We also fight this battle by the word of testimony, by truth. When the devil floods our world with deceit, we fight back by seeking and speaking the truth in all things. We speak the truth about ourselves with honesty and vulnerability and courage, free of shame. We speak the truth about others, about God's love for them and His desire to be in relationship with them. We refuse to take part in spreading lies or half-truths. We are committed to the truth, whether it fits our preconceived notions or not. And we overcome the devil by not letting even the slightest untruth get a hold on us. If it's not consistent with the truth that we have seen and heard from Jesus, we reject it outright. And finally, when the dragon threatens us with death and tries to use death as a bargaining chip to get the church to give in and go along, we respond by not loving our lives so much as to shrink from death. We accept death only for what it is, a transition point for us from this life to the next. We need not fear it, for it holds no true threat for us. No matter what, we will always be with the one who loves us most. So I'd like to close this morning by reading the words to Martin Luther's great hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," which I think provides a compelling summary of the point of Revelation 12 and maybe even the book as a whole. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe does seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate, on earth is not his equal. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. We're not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. You ask who that may be? Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabaoth his name, from age to age the same, and he must win the battle. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him, and that word, above all earthly powers, no thanks to them, abideth. The Spirit and the gifts are ours, through him who with us sideth. Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. Thanks. Have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday.